Let's move for a bit. I want to go to the UN Security Council resolution on the quote stabilization force unquote.
Yes.
There has been a lot of I would use the term anger. I'll use that term. There's been a lot of anger out of certain circles on this issue of Russia and China not necessarily using their veto in order to stop
Yes.
this from going through. Now, both Russia and China put out a rather brutal statement, effectively pointing out this is nonsense. It's going to be the opposite of what they calling for. They listed the failings of let's say the UN resolution, UN Security Council
Yes.
resolution, but they abstained. And
Yes.
people are like, how are you listing all of these failings associated with this and yet abstaining from using the veto, from
Yes.
putting a stop to it? Give me your take on this. What do you think was going on in Russia and China's mind? And I read their response to this, by the way. But again,
Yes.
it's like okay, well, if it's that bad, then how are you not putting a stop to it? The U.S. had no issue putting a stop to also when the United States was calling for when the rest of the world was calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The
Yeah.
United States by itself uses veto over and over and over and
Yes.
over again. And when it finally agreed, they used the term, they said, this is a non-binding UN Security Council resolution, so we don't have to pay attention to the fact that this UN resolution is passed. So when people
Yes.
look at that, they think to themselves, okay, well, Russia and China clearly are not in favor of this. And yet
Yes.
they let it go through either way. Give me your take on this. What is going on in their minds?
Well, a couple of bits of background. For 2 years, I was an advisor to the Secretary General of the Arab League. So I know a little bit about Arab politics, but that was a long time ago. I've written a book called The Jackal's Wedding, American Power Arab Revolt, as a kind of history of Arab resistance to the war against the Arab world. But I left all of that behind when I moved to Russia. And so I'm a bit out of Arab politics. But let's start with the proposition which I mentioned before. In war, and Hamas, the Palestinians are at war with Israel, and Israel is in genocidal war with them. In war, words don't count. First point. Second, the UN Security Council and the United Nations have already discredited themselves, and the UN Secretary General Guterres have all thoroughly discredited themselves from Russian point of view in the current war in the Ukraine. From a Russian point of view, Guterres has been consistently biased in favor of the Ukrainian Anglo-American side. And Russia's been the only power in the UN Security Council to attack Guterres directly and personally for his betrayals of his independent, neutral role. And put his name into Dances with Bears and you'll dig up all sorts of awful stories of Guterres's involvement during the Battle of Mariupol to try to rescue some of the Azov brigades operating in bunkers deep underneath Mariupol. I won't go into the individual stories. My point is the UN Security Council has already discredited itself. Its words don't count in war. And in the Russian war, the UN Security Council has repeatedly taken against the Russian side. So the problem of the credibility of the UN Security Council, its veto, its words, its resolutions, Russian side has no illusion about how empty it is. And therefore, we come to this problem. UN Security Council Resolution 2803. It was rushed through the process. And the principal opponent of the US draft was Russia, not China. Yes, at the end of the process, and I put them up on Dances with Bears, you can read the explanation for the abstention of the Russian side and the explanation of the Chinese side for abstention. The process, in that process, 3 states, members of the UN Security Council, opposed the UN resolution, the US resolution, 2803. Russia, China, and Algeria. There were 2 Arab states who are members of the Security Council, non-permanent members. The 2 Arab states are Somalia and Algeria. There's Sierra Leone is a Muslim state, but let's not get into that part at the moment. Algeria was opposed. Ultimately, Algeria voted for the resolution. It didn't abstain. So here we have a problem. The problem is Russia, and I'll just go through the process because UN Security Council is a war of words. And in the war of words, there's a problem of how to say, very reasonable, moral people are very angry, just like you said, Jamal, at the refusal of Russia and China to veto this. And I'm going to try and explain why in that process, one can understand why Russia did what it did and why it didn't cast a veto. The process started with the US, with Michael Waltz's draft of the resolution, opposed by Russia, China, and Algeria. Russia comes up with an alternative draft resolution.
Right.
The US then issues basically an ultimatum to all the Arab states, all of them, including the Palestine state, the Palestine Authority, Mahmoud Abbas's entity. Either you vote for this or we take significant retaliatory measures. What happens is that it's very difficult for the Arab states, certainly with the way the Arab League works. If you've got Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan is part of this, but it's a minor state. Qatar and the UAE are not minor. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE are financial powerhouses. Egypt is a major Arab power. All of them not only supported the Trump plan when first announced and celebrated with him at Sharm el-Sheikh, but they were joined by Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia, major Muslim states in endorsing the plan and then the resolution. So what the US did, the US delegation, was to line up all the major Muslim powers and all the major Arab powers plus Mahmoud Abbas to show the Russians first, but the Chinese second, they were totally isolated. And they were. And they've admitted that even Algeria flipped.
Yeah.
So when the Chinese and the Russians hand out their explanation statements, they say much the same thing. We opposed. These are all the reasons we opposed, but we were faced with a united Arab bloc that asked us not to veto. And we don't get into the reasons for non-veto, because essentially everybody, including Hamas, agree to the ceasefire and want to protect the remaining Palestinians from further genocidal war by the Israelis. Mm-hmm. We can go on, and I respect those who point out that Russian policy in the Middle East has faults. It has not mentioned the word genocide. It has not criticized Israel for genocide. But we're not here to get into the long history of Russian Middle Eastern policy, its failures in Libya, its failures in Syria, and so on. What you asked was how and why Russia abstained, China abstained on 2803. And their explanation is we faced a block of all the Arab states and the Turks, a major strategic ally in Russia's war against US sanctions. Mm. They asked us not to veto, and we abstained. Now, here's the kicker. The kicker is in the Russian statement, but not the Chinese. The Russian statement is the UN Security Council has no legality. It cannot violate international human rights law, and it cannot deprive the Palestinians of sovereignty. It cannot deprive the Palestinians of the right to defending their sovereignty and themselves. The Hamas statement says all of this. The Russian position is nothing the UN Security Council says in words makes a difference on the ground. The Russian side's been very clear. The BOP, the Board of Peace, chaired by President Trump, with a new British overseer like Tony Blair, or maybe Tony Blair advised, with his hand held, or some other part of him held by Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff and the others, will now have a new mandate over Palestine and over Gaza. And the genocide will continue by less than warring means. Look, it's very clear that's what's happening. And it's a war that Hamas and the Palestinians must fight. And they've been doing remarkably well at fighting, making Israel go the long war, which Israel cannot sustain. It can't sustain a long war against Iran. It can't sustain a long war against the Houthis. It can't sustain a long war against Hamas. As weak, as divided, as destroyed as Hamas, Hezbollah, the so-called axis of Arab resistance with Iran, has, no matter how weak they are, in that war, they are doing what they can, and the UN Security Council's BOP, its transition military force, its selected Palestinian technocratic stooges, all of the structure of the Trump plan, which is annexed to the resolution to make it look even more kosher. None of this is all words on paper. If from a Russian point of view, a veto would have contradicted their acceptance of the ceasefire itself. The UN Security Council doesn't add legality to the facts on the ground.
I see.
I'm not excusing. We're not having a moral conversation here.
No.
I've heard reasonable people of goodwill who understand Arab politics, who are angry, who are right to be angry, of course, and I share that view. But to misunderstand what the Russians thought they could do in that limited arena using a UN Security Council that's totally discredited already, what could they do? And this is what they did against a US attempt to make the fantasy of the BOP, the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, and all of that, make it look as if it's got legality from the UN. It doesn't. The legality was set out by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion late in October. Could the Russian side have said, we will adopt the ICJ advisory opinion and state that this resolution has no legality? We'll veto it because it didn't have any legality. We will veto it because it doesn't assure Palestinian sovereignty, etc., etc., etc. Well, it could have done so. And if you're sitting as an armchair general or an armchair Arabist, you could say Russia blew its responsibility. But armchairs a long way away aren't the way this war of words is fought in the UN headquarters. And anyway, each of these states calculates the UN Security Council 280, Resolution 2803, is a dead piece of paper when it comes to Gaza. Hamas will fight on, but Hamas's statement, look at Hamas's statement. It repeats these major goals for Palestinian sovereignty and the right of resistance, the right of self-defense. I don't need to tell everybody, yeah. So not you, Jamal. But Hamas's statement doesn't deny that it too accepted the ceasefire arrangement because it saves lives, Palestinian lives. It's not going to be demilitarized. It's not going to disarm. It points out that this resolution simply internationalizes the task the Israeli army couldn't achieve by itself. Now, the Chinese explanation, the Russian explanation, don't deny that reality. That's the reality on the ground.
John, I have appreciated this conversation. I really have. Thank you for this. Honest to God, great breakdown, great
don't
explanation.
Bring God into it, for God's sake.
It's figure of speech, just figure of speech.
Okay.
But no, I've genuinely appreciated this, honestly. John Helmer, he is, come on, there we are. He is longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia, the only Western journalist to erect his own independent bureau, absent national or commercial ties. He is a regular presenter on topics in China, Western Europe, and the United States, and has published several books in the United States on military and political topics. John, oh, and by the way, you can check his blog out on Dances with Bears. It is a fantastic blog. I've followed that thing for like a year now. Thank you for this. You be safe,
Thank
okay?
you for having me, Jamal. I hope we come back, and I hope that these tricky, complicated things that we've been trying to explain will interest our audience with your encouragement.
Oh, it does.
Look carefully before we all jump.
No, 1,000% it does. And I would love to have you back. I swear. Yeah, I would love to have you back. Be safe. Thank you, man.
Much. Cheers.
All right. Great breakdown by John. Fantastic breakdown by